Are we wiser than God? I put out the question, what should happen to a thief? In the draconian world, Draco, he would have people executed who were thieves. In the Muslim world, they cut off their hand. In some cultures, they are flogged. Under biblical law, in an American culture, depending on what's stolen, they pay a fine or they go to prison. Okay? In biblical law, the thief is to restore. It's called restitution. It's called restitution. And if the item that is taken by him is found in his possession, he restores the item and a certain amount beyond that. If the item is not found in his possession, then he is, depending on the item stolen, is to pay double. Okay? So his hand's not cut off. He's not executed. He's not flogged. He's not put in a prison cell. He pays restitution. And if he can't pay restitution, then his labor is sold until the debt is paid. So he becomes basically an indentured servant to somebody long enough to pay the debt to the victim of the crime. Restitution. That's it. Now, I use this because it's a little bit on the simple side, because most of us would recoil from cutting someone's hand off because they stole something. And then, of course, the issue is, what about if they stole a stick of gum? Or if they stole a car, or if they stole $1 million. In other words, we intuitively know that some forms of theft, some items stolen, some crimes are worse than others. But I digress. Let's go to Romans chapter 13 to prove my point. This is going to be really important for some of you. Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 4. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, he who resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of him who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. Stop right there for a minute. The reason I read all 4 of these verses, or 3.5 of them together, is because there's some people who believed, I actually debated a man who thought that Jews who were being hidden by Germans during the Nazi Holocaust, if a Nazi authority came and knocked on the door, that the German citizen was required to give up the Jew, and that the German citizen was sinning by hiding the Jew because they were not obeying the authority. In other words, some people take Romans chapter 13 and use it as a blanket permission slip to tyrants, so that tyrants can do anything that they want, and we're required, because Romans 13 says to, we're required to obey. This is an absolutely false interpretation of Romans chapter 13. Completely false, heretical, demonic. It's a demonic interpretation. Look at what the text says. It says, rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. If you don't want to have fear of him who's in authority, do what is good, and you'll receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. Do you get it? At the beginning of the passage, it says that all authorities are established by God. In other words, God sets up these authorities. But he keeps on saying good and evil, good and evil. Who defines good and evil? Only God. So, and by the way, interestingly, this passage was used by theologians in America during the American Revolution to justify the American Revolution. The concept is very simple. If somebody is in a position of authority, but then they betray God and betray God's laws, and they have a pattern of betraying God's laws, then they have rejected their office. they have refused to submit to God, and therefore they become an illegitimate ruler. Let's assume that there's a pastor in a church, and he is known to be doing all kinds of wicked, evil things. And he says, I'm your pastor, and Peter wrote that you're supposed to submit to me. Do what I tell you. And he's got all kinds of wicked things going on. Using people, abusing people. Are the people of his flock required to obey him? Of course not, because he doesn't have the authority from God to order people to do these things. You know that intuitively. The same is true for civil government. Let me finish this last passage. I got to take a break, but I want to finish this. He said, but if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. He is the servant of God to execute his wrath on the wrongdoer. That is the purpose of government. We saw what Paul wrote in 1 Timothy. Paul wrote this, and he said that the civil magistrate is there. He has the sword, and that's not to spank people, okay? The sword is a type, it represents authority to execute judgment on wrongdoers. He's God's servant. But the day that political official protects evil, protects wicked doers, evildoers, and punishes the righteous, that is when he is no longer God's servant. He's a usurper, he's a tyrant, and we have the right and the authority and the duty to oppose him. And this all stems from the law of God. We are not wiser than God. So our duty is to learn what God said about human behavior and what punishments should be for certain crimes, and then to act accordingly. Mario Cuomo, his son Andrew Cuomo, the current governor of New York, they're not wiser than God. And anyone who thinks he is merely a pretender to the throne of God, a fool, and will receive a very, very sharp and painful awakening when they stand before the true lawgiver. I have been a leader in the pro-life movement for 30 years. And sadly, we have not prevailed in our goal to make it a criminal act to kill an unborn baby. There's reasons why we have failed. I wrote this book, A Humble Plea, to Catholic bishops, to evangelical clergy, and to lay people, explaining where we went wrong and what we have to do to prevail. We've made this available as a PDF online for free. I encourage you to go and download your own copy. Why does a nice guy like me keep getting thrown in jail? I have been arrested almost 50 times and spent over a year of my life locked up in various prison facilities. And I wrote a book, many books. In fact, one of them is called, Why Does a Nice Guy Like Me Keep Getting Thrown in Jail? It's a theological work, answering those who say that the church should not be involved in politics or that we should retreat. I encourage you to get it. In fact, get one and give it to your pastor.